Zachary Evans. I'm the Reservoir Storage Manager for WSP, and I'm here today with PioPetro to give a presentation on the introduction to underground storage, to basically give you an overview of underground natural gas storage and its role within our energy infrastructure. So just going over the things we're going to cover today. We'll first talk about the different types of underground storage and how they are used. We'll talk a little bit on the technical side of things about what makes for a good storage reservoir and facility. We'll talk a little bit about how the facilities are operated during their seasons of need. And then we'll talk a little bit about the commercial value, essentially why this is a business model and why do we use this as part of our domestic energy infrastructure. Then we'll wrap everything up and we'll go from there. So first, starting out, I'd like to give a kind of a technical explanation of what gas storage is. And essentially, gas storage is the injection of natural gas during periods of oversupply. So we can withdraw it during periods where the demand is not as high, or demand is high, I should say, but local supply can't keep up with that demand. Now, usually this is going to be weather dependent, and predominantly it has to do with our own kind of residential heating needs. But there's a lot of different reasons that we use underground storage. But in a nutshell, that's essentially what storage is. That's the technical definition. The more colloquial definition I like to use is gas storage is the often overlooked part of the energy sector that keeps people from freezing to death in the winter during when they live in the Northeast and the Midwest, because residential home heat is still the predominant use of natural gas, and literally or most likely gas storage is used to facilitate that need. So the different types of gas storage that are available are fairly, there's about 5. I've combined hard rock and mined caverns here together, but essentially there's 4 different ways that we store natural gas as an energy sector. The first is depleted reservoir storage, and it's exactly what it sounds like. We store gas in production reservoirs that have been depleted of their naturally occurring hydrocarbons, whether it's oil or gas. And now that we have that empty container, we'll inject gas back into those formations and use it for long-term storage. That's where the gas usually came from, so using it as a short-term housing storage mechanism makes a lot of sense. We also have aquifer storage, which is almost exclusively to the Illinois basin, but essentially it's the same as depleted reservoir, except instead of naturally occurring hydrocarbon reservoirs, these are water-bearing formations. And the benefit of that, though there is some complications with the water production, the benefit of those facilities is you do have that natural water drive because those formations do contain naturally occurring water. Salt caverns are essentially the Cadillac of underground gas storage. And whether that's in a domal salt or a bedded salt deposition, we're essentially storing gas in not the pore space of the reservoir like we are in the previous 2 iterations or examples of gas storage, but in a pure void space that has been created through solution mining or leaching, basically using water to mine out or to dissolve the salt in these salt formations to create a cavern. And then we're able to store gas in that facility. A lot of times the kind of layperson thinks this is what normal oil and gas production is that we drill a well into an underground lake or cavern and suck the oil or gas out. Obviously that's not the way it works, but in the case of salt cavern, that's pretty much exactly what it is. So you have a very high integrity, high pressure environment often with flow strings 20 inches or higher. So very high deliverability opportunity, but you're very limited by your localized geology. And the last type of storage is hard rock caverns, which are mined facilities, which are kind of room and pillar type mining activities where we can store hydrocarbons and other liquids. This is mostly used for actual liquid storage, not necessarily natural gas, but I did want to include that just to be complete. So talking now about just a brief example of what we're talking about graphically. Depleted fields obviously can range in a variety of depths that we'll go into before, but it's essentially the same kind of situation where you're drilling down into or using previously drilled wells in those existing formations. Depleted aquifers are usually going to be a little bit shallower, slightly lower pressure with that naturally occurring water in there. And then here's an example of salt in which you have that kind of molten injection of salt within the geologic column, and then you can solution mine a physical cavern inside of that allows you to store the gas there. Now, if we look at where these facilities exist around the country, you see the predominance of facilities are in Appalachia and Michigan, as well as the Illinois basin, with all of your aquifer storage pretty much being exclusively there in the Illinois basin, in adjacent states there. And then your salt domes, which are the upside down triangles, mostly along the Gulf. And the reason for these separations is pretty straightforward. Number one, most of your reservoir storage is in the Northeast because that's where a lot of localized production was, but more importantly, that's where the majority of your market is. That's where it gets the coldest in the winter, so that's where most of your pipeline companies and storage companies are based. So they're up in that area because you want to be close to the market. Aquifers are the same way. That's just the nature of the deposition there, and most of the naturally occurring salt formations are down in the south and along the Gulf. Obviously, we would like to take advantage of salt caverns in every locale if we could, but we are limited by our geology. But essentially, here's where all the facilities are, with the overwhelming justification or reason for those facilities being in those spots being based on where the markets are. Part of it's where the gas is coming from, but more importantly, it's where your end user ultimately is, which is mostly in the Midwest and the Northeast. Just taking a look at this from a statistical standpoint, if you look at the top 10 states within the country in terms of how much working gas capacity they have, you see that a lot of states here in the Appalachian and the Midwest kind of lead that effort, with Texas and Louisiana and traditional oil and gas states still being part of that. And you can see numerically what we're talking about: a very small number of aquifers and a small number of salt facilities with a very high number of depleted reservoir assets. Those are going to be kind of the norms in terms of that percentage breakdown. So most of your volume and most of your asset count comes from depleted reservoirs, but being slightly lower pressure and slightly higher well count, it's somewhat dwarfed in terms of efficiency by your salt facilities, and to a lesser extent the aquifers. Looking at some more specifics in terms of what these facilities look like, again, they're depleted reservoirs, so they're very similar in that regard, but they do need to have different aspects to them that would make them a good production reservoir, but may not make for a great storage reservoir. The good storage reservoirs we see in operation, you can see the ranges there. Your reservoir storage can range all the way from a few 100 pounds at a few 100 feet of depth, all the way to very high pressure, 3,000 or 4,000 psi fields at the 10,000 foot level and beyond. Aquifers are going to be much shallower than that just because of the nature of this deposition. And then your salt can range there too. But the difference here being is the high end of your salt pressures. Salt being a much more integral geologic formation rather than your traditional reservoir sands and limestones. You can pressure those up to a much higher pressure, which of course results in better deliverability. And this translates onto the capacity. So we're talking about the billions of cubic feet that we can actually store. You can see that the overwhelming majority of our volume on the system domestically comes from those traditional depleted reservoir fields. But you can see the deliverability doesn't necessarily correlate one-to-one. You can see we're getting a lot of our deliverability from our depleted reservoirs, but if you see on a percentage basis, you're getting a tremendous amount of performance from the lower volume and lower count salt facilities that we have. Again, because they're higher pressure, they have they're just a better delivery system for the gas, but again, these are geographically limited. So in entirety, using all three of these sets of assets, we can use gas storage to help support our energy infrastructure. And that concludes the first portion of this presentation, and we'll talk a little bit more about the commercial aspects of underground storage and the technical requirements in the next video.